Terra Arcanum is a world filled with wonder. From the four planes to the mysterious abyss, nearly everything has a story to tell. But to learn more about this fantastic world, we need to dive deeper than the books and the tabletop RPG. Join me as we reveal the secrets of Terra Arcanum. Lucifer's forces quickly overcame Yevon's at the interplanetary gate, forcing them into a retreat. But Lucifer knew simply holding the gate wouldn't be enough. He couldn't send his armies through without leaving himself vulnerable to a counterattack. So he assigned his top researchers to break the seal and reopen the gate, while his armies continued to push the Nanameans back. Lucifer spread his generals out across the systems to cover any potential holes that Yevon might exploit to encircle him. His right hand, Aziel, led his primary forces, while his left hand, Baal, coordinated the movements of the generals in the outer sectors of space. Meanwhile, Lucifer was kept busy balancing the warfront and the progress on the gate. Though initially defeated, Yevon was far from ready to give up. He rallied his soldiers in the solar system closest to the gate and put in a request for supplies and reinforcements from Nunam. He formed a wall with his armies and entrenched them to slow the advance of the Kaldraxi. This worked for a few weeks, but the overwhelming power and number of Lucifer's armies proved too much for even their superior weapons and technology. Again, Yevon fell back. He pulled his armies in to prevent the center from collapsing, and held firm until his reinforcements arrived. With his armies supplied and ready, he went on the offensive. He had his generals target the weaker outer sector Kaldraxi forces, hoping to force the main army to divert troops to assist the flanks. The Kaldraxi response, however, was nothing like what Yevon anticipated. Lucifer didn't aid his flanks. Instead, he ordered a full assault for the primary force. After again forcing Yevon into a retreat, he then had his main army break into two units. The first set up a defensive formation to hold the sector they had just conquered, while the second unit swung around and surrounded Yevon's forces in one of the outer sectors of space. The Naname that were cut off quickly surrendered, dealing another large blow to Yevon. Thankfully, two of his other generals in other sectors had been securing victory after victory, and were quickly gaining ground towards Kelyur. Yevon tried to push this advantage, while Lucifer's primary army was split by attacking the defensive line. Though ultimately a success, the cost left Yevon's own army in shambles. He needed to reinforce his front before the second unit returned, and in order to do this had to pull one of his generals and two of the armies out from the sectors that were already winning. Shortly after the Naname surrendered to Aziel, after he had surrounded them, the right hand of Lucifer disappeared. The tactics of Kaldraxia changed after that. While Lucifer's forces, still aggressive as ever, most of them seemed single-mindedly determined to strike at the heart of Naname. But thanks again to his remaining general in the outer sector holding the line, a hole was opened up in the Kaldraxian line. They had left themselves exposed, and they gave Yevon the opportunity he needed. He sent one of his generals to punch through the weakened line and cut off Lucifer's main force. For the first time in the war, Lucifer had to retreat. His primary force fell back to the outer sectors he still had control over. He then gathered his soldiers and moved them to defend Kelyur, while Yevon closed in. Before the Naname could lay siege to Kelyur, Lucifer ordered an attack on the sectors nearest to Kelyur. His armies were then to wrap around and disrupt the Nanamean supply lines. The initial attack was executed flawlessly, and the result crippled Yevon's flanks severely. Unfortunately, Lucifer's troops were intercepted by Yevon's forces before they could hit the supply lines. This would be Lucifer's last victory of the war. Yevon rallied his armies and set about taking back the interplanetary gate. Lucifer held them back for 19 Terran months, but eventually his army would fall, and the Nanamean would claim the gate. Yevon sued for peace after the victory, but Lucifer would not be denied. He continued to fight back until he had lost 6 sectors, and his army was a mere fraction of what it once was. He then agreed to meet with Yevon and discuss the terms of his surrender. The Treaty of Kelyur saw to it that neither governance of the Immortal Plane was to interfere with the development of the Mortal Plane. However, Lucifer refused to sign it until a clause was added that nullified the treaty and its agreements should the Mortal Plane ever prove a threat to the Immortal Plane. Yevon could not help but to agree with his old friend on that one point, and so the treaty was signed in blood and magic. Yevon returned to Nunam and began the hard work of rebuilding. Lucifer went home as well, where he had his researchers begin looking for another way into the mortal plane. This would eventually yield results that would allow individual Kaldraxi of immense power to temporarily travel to the mortal plane. This breakthrough would in time reach Nunam And Yevon at first decreed it to be a breach of the treaty, but when Lucifer revealed that he was not directly interfering and merely keeping tabs on the mortal plane, Yevon reluctantly allowed it only as long as the secret to such an ability was shared with Naname. This uneasy peace has lasted for millions of years, and as Yevon watched the mortals grow, his fear that they might one day prove Lucifer correct and nullify the treaty grew as well. And one thought always lingered on the edge of his mind. What had happened to Aziel?